So our next speaker is Dr. Tanis Hinchcliffe and Richard Hill. Dr. Tanis Hinchcliffe is a retired reader in history of architecture at University of Westminster, London, and has researched and written extensively on housing history. Today, Tanis and Richard will be sharing their ideas on the changing meaning of dissent throughout the history of Newington Green and the Meeting House. So I'd leave the stage to Richard and Tanis.
This is a joint piece of work by me and Tanis. The good bits are the bits that Tanis did, and the ropey bits are the bits that I filled in. Newington Green Meeting House was established by Presbyterian dissenters in 1708 and became a Unitarian chapel in the mid-18th century. It has always been a dissenting place of worship in the technical sense that its congregation have not accepted the religious authority of the Church of England. But there is a broader meaning to dissent, and our question is, to what extent can the term be applied to the life of the meeting house in the 19th and early 20th centuries? In 1800, Newington Green was a suburban village, one of many around the outskirts of London. You can, oh, sorry, can you go back to the map? No, back to the first one, please. Yeah. Can you keep it on there? Newington Green is the green bit in the middle. The main roads leading to it were attracting ribbon development of houses at the very beginning of the 19th century, but the filling in of the farmland around the green began in the 1840s in the Mildmay estate to the southeast over there. This was followed by the development of Albert Town between Milton Grove and Spencer Grove in that direction. And then through the 1850s and 1860s, the whole area between Green Lanes and Stoke Newington High Street was built up. The land west of Green Lanes was developed between the 1850s and the 1880s with much larger houses. The process was complete by the end of the century with the red brick houses of Carrisford Road and Clissold Crescent. The 1899 Booth map of London poverty shows that you can probably just about see a difference in tone of the areas to the west and east of Green Lanes. You can certainly see the yellow gold strip of Highbury New Park going up, the very richest part of the area.
Moving away from the microphone, Richard. Could you stay with the microphone, please?
I'm sorry. The 1899 Booth map shows the social difference between east and west of Green Lanes. To the east, householders vary from fairly comfortable to poor. On the west side, they are middle class, well-to-do, upper middle, and upper class. I'm sorry. At the end of the 19th century, this roughly 1 square mile of London on the map sustained 38 places of worship. About 10 of these were Anglican, from the very grand St. Mary's, Stoke Newington, to small mission chapels such as All Saints in Aidan Grove. The rest, by definition, were nonconformist or dissenting, with almost every kind of Protestantism represented, as well as one Roman Catholic church and one synagogue. The Newington Green Meeting House was one of the smaller congregations, with about 80 members. Its religious practice had changed significantly during the century. Thomas Cromwell, who's memorialized there, minister from 1838 to 1864, came from the Church of England with a preference for a liturgical service. The Essex Street prayer book was adopted. This was based on the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, modified to conform to Unitarian theology. A liturgy is basically the framework for religious services, but liturgical has a more specialist meaning in 19th century England, denoting a move towards more elaborately choreographed services with the priest and congregation in formal dialogue and with a greater importance put on music. At the extreme, it denotes the high church world of gorgeous vestments, elaborate architectural settings, incense. Newington Green did not go to these extremes, but in 1840 they did acquire an organ for the first time. William Wooding, minister from 1881 to 1906, Wooding I think is over there, reintroduced the communion service, which had been discontinued many years before, and presided over the reordering of the apse, this area here, with a better organ, there's an organ in the middle, choir stalls either side, in place of the egg cup pulpit, which you've probably seen photographs of, from which Richard Price had delivered his sermons in the 18th century. The meeting house was moving towards a Protestant middle ground, not high church, but leaving behind the austere 18th century pattern of worship, a less abrasive kind of dissent, perhaps. One index of these changes was at the end of the 19th century, it re-signed itself as a church rather than as a chapel or a meeting house. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. This is an unfamiliar picture, same building, but called something different. This picture was actually taken in 1954, so it stayed as a church for quite a long time. The small but energetic congregation the meeting house organized numerous social projects. A Sunday school was set up in 1840 and a day school ran from 1860 to 1870. In 1887, the schoolhouse was built behind the meeting house, and at its height, 200 children attended. There were young men's and young women's societies, a Providence Society, Savings Bank, library, mothers' meetings, Band of Hope, Temperance Society, summer excursions. Doing these kinds of things was not a mark of dissent. They were the staples of urban Christianity for both low and high churches. Larger churches could do much more than Newington Green. St. Mary's, Stoke Newington, for example, had a prodigious range of outreach projects, and at the turn of the century had no fewer than 120 Sunday school teachers. There must have been somewhere between 500 and 1,000 kids in the Sunday school. So again, the meeting house was in the middle ground in terms of scale of things that it could achieve. This raises the question of where the meeting house stood on the political spectrum at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And we'd like to discuss two cases. In 1907, Dr. F.G.W. Fote was appointed minister. It soon became apparent that he was a supporter of the New Theology movement of the Reverend R.J. Campbell, who had, in 1907, quote, declared his conviction that socialism was the practical form of Christianity, unquote. In 1908, Campbell, then a Congregationalist minister, was elected to the executive of the Fabian Society, the intellectual wing of the socialist movement. And on a number of occasions, he shared a platform with Keir Hardie, the first leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party. A petition of members of the congregation succeeded in its aim of removing Fote as minister. We don't know whether their objection was primarily to Fote's politics or to the new theology that he supported, or whether it was a combination of both. the 40 signatories to the petition, 10 were members of the Pritchard family, who, along with the Youngs, the Turners, and the Titfords, had dominated the life of the meeting house for many years previously. That's the memorial to Pritchard. I can't remember his first name. Andrew Pritchard, yep. Foate's replacement as minister was Lionel Taylor, who served from 1910 to 1923. His career raises important and disturbing questions. He was born in 1874 and qualified as a doctor in 1900. He worked at the Stoke Newington Dispensary, a charitable medical service, for 6 years, and was then appointed lecturer in biology and sociology for London University extension classes. He wrote prolifically. I've read a fraction of it. The subjects are various, but a recurrent theme is that an understanding of society must be built up from the biological sciences. The intellectual framework is what we would now call social Darwinism. One of Taylor's most striking ideas, first expressed in Aspects of Social Evolution of 1904, is that an understanding of human types built up from biology should be the basis of social science. Members of a type have distinctive bodily characteristics and physiognomy, and they have distinctive intellectual, emotional, and moral characteristics. An example is the rational type. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. Here is the rational type from Aspects of Social Evolution of 1904. Individuals who belong to this type look like this. They are manipulative and amoral, with little emotional or moral constraint over their intellectual aims. And I'm going to quote Taylor here. This Machiavellian type, whether it be exemplified in the Jew stock exchange jobber, in the English scum aristocrat, or as leader in a retrograde religion, or least harmful form as a mere speculating philosopher, or perhaps research experimentalist, is always a danger to social life, end quote. Sometimes you read something and you wish you hadn't. Taylor's discussion of human types is complex and detailed, particularly the question of the relationship between environment and heredity, as you'd expect. But assumptions about the superiority of civilized rather than savage types are near the surface, as are racist and discriminatory attitudes, as we've seen. In 1909, Taylor published The Nature of Woman. The theme is that women are fundamentally different from men, initially for biological reasons. They become more different as society develops, and consequently there is no reason why they should share the civil rights that men possess. Although they're distinctively different from men, their social role and personal fulfillment is to be a man's wife and a mother to their children. Taylor criticizes Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill for applying a, quote, rationalist approach to the question of the rights of women and for ignoring the importance of the biological differences between men and women. The critique of rationalism recurs in his Social Life and the Crowd, published in 1923. This is a criticism of the idea that democracy can work in a modern society. Ruling elites and the yellow press manipulate the system from above, and the masses are drawn to the distractions of drink, the music hall, and the cinema, and are too befuddled to make rational choices. Taylor criticizes Richard Price, campaigner for democracy, for his, quote, undetailed and vague prediction that it would all come out well, unquote. To return to the question of dissent, Taylor was a dissenter in religious matters, and his social Darwinist ideas involve a measure of dissent from received opinion of the early 20th century. Overcrowding, poverty, ill health, drunkenness, vice, gambling are recurrent themes, and the cry for reform is loud. However, there is also a profound conservatism, and his outlook has little in common with our current understanding of dissent or with the late 18th century dissenting world of Richard Price and Joseph Priestley. This is an uncomfortable place at which to end our talk. After all, this event is not just about dissent, it's a festival of dissent, a celebration of its achievements and potential, but there is little to feel festive about in Taylor's writings. Like the wedding guests hurrying to the feast and buttonholed by the ancient mariner, we are being told things we would rather not hear. There was a ship, quoth he. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still and listens like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. Fortunately, we'll be able to tear ourselves away because I think probably lunch is not far away. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. This was a different kind of dissent, and good to be reminded. Any questions, anyone, to Tanis or Richard?
Have you got a nicer image we can look at from your set? Have you got a nicer image of a face, or is there just the one of the rational person? You've got a picture up there of the rational type.
No, I'm sorry.
Who's kind of like a Mendelssohn, I see, type. Have you got other options that we can gaze at?
I'm sorry, this is the only one I brought.
Just got the rationalist. Okay.
There's a very nice drawing of the scum and the dreg.
The dreg. Okay, thank you.
The drawings, I don't know how I know this, but I think the drawings were done by his wife.
Okay, for another talk, perhaps. For another talk about the wife and her artistic talents.
Thank you.
You mentioned how this place changed from a chapel to a church. Can you just explain what's the distinction? What makes a church, and did anything change in the role of the meeting house from becoming a church from a chapel?
In the 18th century, I'm sorry. In the 18th and 19th century, as a general rule, dissenting places of worship were called chapels, sometimes meeting houses, and the term church would only have been used for an Anglican, that's a Church of England church. So to rename it as a church is actually of some significance, and it shows to what extent the Unitarians based here moved towards the centre ground of Protestantism.
Am I right in thinking that chapels were not allowed to have steeples?
It would be, yes, that's right, yes. And I think that was in the 1662 settlement at the restoration of Charles II. Yeah. It wouldn't have been true in the 19th century because there are some very elaborate neo-Gothic Unitarian churches at that time. Yeah.
I was thinking about your mention of Lionel Taylor. Just over 100 years ago, he lived through the First World War. He was minister at the time of the War Memorial, 15 names that are on there. And of course, in 1908 was the break-even year when motor-driven vehicles started to outnumber horse-driven vehicles. He would have seen all this technological change. But in World War I, when really only Britain and France were democracies, if we'd lost that war, that would have been the end of European democracy for a long time. That's what they were fighting for. But at the end of World War I, democracy was preserved, but women also got the vote straight away. I wonder if he made any comment about that.
Well, it is interesting that Taylor publishes the anti... it's basically an anti-suffrage book in 1909, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think is roughly the high point of the suffrage movement. So he's making a very spirited intervention into this political question. The Unitarians supported the First World War, you know, unlike Quakers who didn't support it. And very tragically, I think it's about 12 or so members of this congregation were killed. 15, sorry, yeah. And Taylor did actually go to France and deliver lectures to the troops, apparently. So God knows what they thought of it.
I would also mention that without the help of the women at the time, who didn't actually go to fight, but we couldn't have won the war.
Yeah, this is true.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard and Tanis again.